Glenn Fuguitt graduated from the University of Florida in 1950 with a BA in sociology. He earned his PhD 6 years later at the University of Wisconsin and then was hired as an assistant professor there at Wisconsin. He spent his entire career, spanning more than 50 years, in that same sociology department, where he's now professor emeritus. Throughout that time, he has been a frequent advisor to the U.S. government, to state governments, and to several professional associations on rural and agricultural conditions and policies. This article is the published version of his presidential address from the year when he was elected as president of the Rural Sociological Association. It provides a basic demographic and statistical picture of the stagnation of rural America in the mid-20th century, in contrast to the rapid expansion of metropolitan areas during the same period. When you consider the stability of the figures that he presents here, keep in mind the dynamic changes in urban populations seen in other readings. When Glenn Fuguitt presented this talk a half-century ago at the Rural Sociological Association conference, some people saw the issue of population at the root of many social issues and problems. And not just the usual issue of population growth, but the issue of population distribution, where people are, not just how many of them there are. On one hand, the preceding decade had witnessed urban decay, rising unemployment, social pathology, and even riots in the streets. Many central cities literally were on fire in the hot summers of the 1960s. Around these problem centers, the suburbs had been spreading and sprawling over the landscape, raising an entirely different set of questions. And as Fuguitt points out in this article, the rural, non-metropolitan world had been experiencing problems of its own, even though most Americans weren't paying much attention to that. If we consider the map of counties that gained or lost population in the 3 decades before Fuguitt wrote his article, we see clear patterns. The shaded areas of counties that were losing population concentrate in the rural Midwest, from the Canadian border in the Dakotas to the Gulf of Mexico in Texas and Louisiana, the heartland along the great central river valleys of the Missouri, the Mississippi, and the Ohio. Secondary zones of population loss take in the Appalachian Mountains and the historic plantation belt of the Deep South. All these areas lost people throughout the middle of the 20th century. The process has been called the hollowing out of America. When he titled this article, "The Places Left Behind," the first question we probably need to ask is, left behind by who? And the answer, of course, is left behind by people who were leaving, going somewhere else. By now, we're quite familiar with the process of urbanization, and we know that more specifically, these places were left behind by people who were leaving the farms and the rural areas and migrating to metropolitan centers. Part of this picture is the great migration of both black and white rural populations out of the Deep South and into the great industrial cities around the Great Lakes and the northern Atlantic seaboard, places like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Part of the picture is the Dust Bowl migration of displaced farmers from the heartland to these same cities and also to the West Coast, which largely was immune to the population declines he writes about. In general, this population shift was from rural to metropolitan areas. Of course, we also know by now that the people leaving rural America were not just a random sample of the population. Migration always concentrates mostly among young adults, people old enough to move around on their own, but not yet tied down to a particular place by careers and family ties. This means that net out-migration will change the age distribution of a place. For example, the average age of farmers had been rising dramatically when Fuguitt wrote this article, and it continued to rise in the half-century that has passed since then. Today, a third of the people who operate American farms are over 65, and nearly another third are between 55 and 64. When young adults leave these rural counties, this will also mean that future birth rates will be lower, because the people who are left behind are not in the main childbearing ages. If we follow up Fuguitt's article in 1970 we find that in the next 50 years, the trend that he was writing about has continued for the most part. A map similar to the one from his time shows that the shrinking counties are still concentrated in roughly the same parts of the country, especially the high plains about midway between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, and also along the Mississippi itself and in the Appalachian Mountain region. The plantation belt in the Deep South seems to have recovered to some extent, with more localized spots of population decline, and we'll return to this point later. But the key point is that in the decades after Fuguitt's article, just as in the decades he studied, depopulation of rural America has continued along the same track. This rural depopulation brings with it a whole host of social problems, some of them actually similar to the problems of our central cities, and others that are unique to the rural areas. The biggest issue is simply the question of critical mass for social institutions. When a place loses population, it generally loses jobs faster than people. With the loss of jobs, fewer businesses can operate profitably and survive. Stores close. Tax revenues fall. Decreasing numbers of children mean that schools close. Churches close. More people move away, and the vicious cycle continues, reinforcing itself decade after decade. This is why Fuguitt was writing about it. He is not just documenting some interesting statistics, he's writing about the disappearance of a way of life along with the people in these rural places. Now, a committed believer in laissez-faire doctrines who trusts the anonymous forces of the marketplace to solve all problems might well ask, so what? If rural areas are losing population, drying up and blowing away like tumbleweeds, that simply means that people have found better alternatives somewhere else. What are we going to do? Try to force people to stay out in the middle of Nebraska when they would rather be in Atlanta or Dallas or Los Angeles? Last one out of town, turn out the lights. But Fuguitt and others are not ready to give up on rural America without a fight. That is what it means to talk about population distribution policy. This dry-sounding phrase really means trying to go against the tide of rural depopulation, to figure out some subtle ways to stack the deck with deliberate government policies in order to revive and stimulate rural communities and allow people who still live out there between the coasts and between the great metropolitan areas to continue to enjoy some kind of quality of life. Is this a heroic quest they're on, or is it misguided meddling? Something for us all to think about. Before we examine the details of Fuguitt's results, first we need to recognize exactly what part of American society he was studying. Probably everyone who reads the article understands immediately that his focus is on the non-metropolitan population of the United States. Now, the term metropolitan has a very specific meaning for census data, such as he is using. Certain counties in the U.S. are designated as metropolitan, while others are not. So we must keep in mind that throughout this article, counties form the basic unit of analysis. To be metropolitan, a county must include an incorporated place, that is, a place with a legally recognized boundary and an organized government, with at least 50,000 residents inside that city or town. The county must have at least 100,000 total residents. There's no requirement for a specific population density because the land area of that city or its county does not enter into the definition. Any county with at least 100,000 people and with at least 50,000 of them living in an incorporated place becomes metropolitan. All other counties are non-metropolitan places. But be sure to keep in mind that non-metropolitan does not mean rural. Rural is a much older concept for the census, and only people outside of incorporated places with 2,500 or more residents count as rural. So rural is a small slice of what we and Fuguitt are calling non-metropolitan here. Non-metro counties include lots of small towns with more than 2,500 people, as we recognize as soon as we look at Fuguitt's tables in the article. During the decades leading up to the 1970 census, the balance between the metropolitan and non-metro counties shifted for the U.S. population. The metro population increased from 69 million in 1940 to 137 million by 1970, doubling in 30 years. During the same 3 decades, the non-metro population actually dropped from 81 million to 63 million. In other words, the metro growth of almost 70 million included 18 million people who left the non-metro areas and moved to cities. The other 52 million new metro residents represent the baby boom of post-war births to people already in those cities. No wonder then that Fuguitt called his article "Those Left Behind." And the shrinking non-metro population was not a temporary historical anomaly. Since Fuguitt's article, based on the 1970 census, this trend obviously has continued. Every decade since then, for the next 40 years, the metropolitan population kept right on growing by about 30 million people every 10 years. By comparison, the non-metropolitan population kept on shrinking away until 1990, when it bottomed out at around 50 million people. Since then, this 50 million number has stayed roughly stable, but since the metro population continues to grow, the percent of all Americans outside the metro areas keeps on shrinking. When Fuguitt wrote this article, the percentage already had dropped from a majority, 54% in 1940, to less than a third of the total, 31% by 1970. By 1990, that 31% dropped further to only 20%, and by 2010, only 1/6 of the U.S. population lived outside metro counties. But keep the non-metro county totals in mind when you read Fuguitt's article, because you will see right away that these numbers do not match the numbers in his table. In 1950, there were 70 million people in non-metro counties, but only 26 million people in his Table 1 for the same year. Where were the other 44 million people? If you read more carefully, you discover that Fuguitt is looking only at the people in incorporated places, that is, in small towns in these non-metro counties. He does not count or consider at all the truly rural people living outside of any kind of incorporated place or town. That's where these other 44 million people lived in 1950. By 1960, the total population of non-metro counties dropped to 66 million, and Fuguitt includes 30 million of them in his incorporated towns, leaving 33 million rural people. That means the number of non-metro people outside Fuguitt's measured places dropped by 11 million in those 10 years, even though the population of his towns increased by 4 million. Some of the disappearing farmers ended up in his small towns, and the rest moved into metropolitan areas. Then by 1970, the total for non-metro counties dropped again to 63 million. Fuguitt counts 33 million of them, leaving 30 million in the most rural places. Even though his towns grew again, the rural numbers dropped again, and the two changes just about cancel each other out. While he is looking at places left behind, there are even more rural places out there in America that were losing population even more drastically throughout this period. Just keep in mind that Fuguitt is looking at the small towns of America, not at the total population of the non-metro counties. Within these small towns, Fuguitt notices a more subtle shift that looks perfectly consistent with what we now understand as the hollowing out of rural America. Consider the row in his Table 1 that shows the population of non-metro counties that lived in places with at least 10,000 people. These would be larger small towns, out in the countryside somewhere away from really large cities. These large towns would be bigger, for example, than the town of 5,000 people where I grew up, out in the high desert of eastern Oregon. Between 1950 and 1970, the number of such places multiplied from over 500 to over 700, almost a 50% increase in the number of big towns. This happened in part as some smaller towns grew and actually crossed the boundary into this category of places. Since the size category stays the same, the number of people in all these towns also increased by about 50% during these 2 decades. On the other hand, there were about 8,000 incorporated places in non-metro counties in 1950 that had less than 1,000 people. In fact, most of them had a lot less than 1,000 people because these 8,000 littlest towns only mustered a total of 2.35 million people, an average of 416 people per town. Over the next 20 years, the total number of non-metro towns increased very slightly, from about 8,000 to about 8,400, as some of the towns that had been larger than 1,000 actually drifted down into this group. But the average size of these towns dropped from 416 to 394 people. So the total population in this size class of towns stayed virtually static at about 3.3 million people. These smallest places represented the heart of who Fuguitt is talking about as those left behind in the smallest small-town America. One of the problems with Fuguitt's numbers comes from his use of size categories for places in small-town America. For example, in the lowest size categories, places with less than 1,000 people, the number of towns increased from 8,000 to 8,400 places between 1950 and 1970. Where did the extra 400 towns come from? Brand new towns could spring up out of unincorporated rural areas. Maybe somebody located a factory out in the countryside and a town collected around it. But a town that had more than 1,000 people in 1950 also might lose enough people to slip down into this lowest category by 1970. Looking at each census separately, we can't track a single town over time and see what happened to it. This is why Fuguitt moves on from his Table 1 to track individual towns over time, to see how many of them grew larger, how many stayed the same, and how many perhaps lost population. As we consider his evidence on trends for individual towns, though, we always must remember that all his towns exist in the midst of the vast rural stretches of the American landscape, surrounded by millions of people out there in the unincorporated rural countryside. We already noted that non-metro counties with the greatest population losses concentrated in a broad band down the center of the country from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico. But rural areas in most parts of the country lost people to the big cities then and still continue to lose people to those cities today. Indeed, some of the steepest declines occur in non-metro counties in New England. Only a few places like California or Florida in particular have been mostly immune to decline in their non-metro counties. In his Figure 1, Fuguitt looks at how non-metro towns changed in size over time. First between 1950 and 1960, the dotted lines in the figure, and then between 1960 and 1970, the solid lines in the figure. He actually gives us 8 different charts in this figure in 2 columns of 4. The column on the left shows non-metro towns that are located relatively close to larger metro cities, less than 50 miles from such large places. These are not suburbs as we usually think of them, because those are included in the metropolitan places, but they might gradually turn into suburbs eventually. The column on the right shows non-metro towns farther out into the boondocks, 50 or more miles away from any kind of large central city. Looking down each column, Fuguitt subdivides his towns by regions of the country, from the northeast to the west. In each chart, towns are further classified into 5 groups according to size, with the smallest towns in Group A at the left end of each line, and the largest towns above 10,000 at the right end of each line. The percentage values on each vertical axis mark the percentage of towns in that particular group with growing populations in each of the 2 decades he studied. The slopes of these lines give Fuguitt his first insight into patterns of town growth. For example, if we start with the top 2 charts for the northeast region, we see that the 2 lines are a little higher in the left chart than the right chart. This means that more of the towns closer to big cities were growing than were towns farther away from the cities in those decades. We also see that more towns were growing in the first decade than in the second, because the dotted line is always higher than the solid line. Finally, we see the interesting result that more of the smaller towns
were growing than was true for the larger towns, and that this pattern is stronger for the places farther away from the big cities. Fuguitt interprets these last patterns as support for the people who were saying then that population concentration in bigger and bigger places was slowing down over time. But as soon as we look away from the Northeast, quite a different picture appears, and the Northeast begins to look like the exception to a larger rule. In other regions of the country, the lines almost all slope upward to the right, meaning that the share of towns experiencing growth was higher, the larger the towns we consider. That looks more like continuing concentration in larger places. It is true that the solid line for the second decade is lower than the dotted line for the first decade in most of these other charts, just as it was in the Northeast. This pattern is particularly noticeable in the South, where sizes of towns had little to do with any growth at all in the second decade. But more of the larger towns did seem to grow in most places in both decades, and this tendency also was a little stronger when towns were closer to big cities. These conclusions bring Fuguitt back to his original questions about whether we judge such growth patterns to be good or bad. He points out that in his time, as we still do today, many people were upset about social problems that they linked to population change, but that these ideas often were inconsistent when compared for different kinds of places. For example, many of the problems of cities were blamed on rapid population growth. Environmental problems, problems of traffic, unemployment, crime, political turmoil, and so on. At the same time, people blamed problems in rural areas on population decline instead. Problems of disappearing jobs, stores, schools, and even the entire small town way of life. But why, asked Fuguitt, would renewed population growth be good for rural areas when it is the cause of problems in urban areas? He gives the particularly clear example of migration and poverty. If urban population growth is bringing more poor people to cities and making things worse there, why does it seem like the people leaving the rural areas are the cream of the crop instead? Shouldn't the cream of the crop be good for cities if that's where they're going? In concluding his article, Fuguitt casts his eye again on the idea of trying to come up with deliberate government policies to redistribute population. That is, to discourage the hollowing out of America and to get people to stay in the small towns instead of moving to cities. He wonders, as we might too, whether such policies make any sense. What are we trying to create with such policies? Are we trying to fence in some people in small town America and get them to stay there when they might rather go and live in big cities? And what would happen if we try such policies and they succeed? Will we recreate some small town America as people think of it when they watch the Hallmark Channel on television or visit colonial Williamsburg? How would you like to go and live in a museum? These are questions you might remember as we consider other more recent studies of what is happening outside of the cities that dominate our lives today.